This video is brought to you by members of the Jessie Fam. Thanks to each and every one of you for being here. If you have been a member in the past, you are no longer a member because I started new membership and new membership levels with more benefits. Click on the join button or search for the link down in the description to become a member of the Jessie Fam. Now on to the video. Urban legends. They are ingrained on our psyche ever since early childhood. Our family tells us these stories to instill fear in us in order to keep us safe. You don't want to walk out there at night. You don't know who's out there. Beware of the boogeyman, for he might get you. Today we are going to explore some of the scariest stories you have ever heard. The Horrible Hook. The evening was still warm when Jimmy and Suzanne left the movies. It was a perfect night to be out, and they were in no hurry to get home. After picking up a snack, Jimmy suggested they go down to the lake. The young couple often drove there to enjoy the scenery, listen to the radio, or talk. As they usually did, they parked the car alongside the gravel road in a spot that offered a great view. A light breeze blew through the open windows. Moonlight shimmered on the water, and a line of ducks floated by. Jimmy turned the radio on and found a station playing quiet music. Suzanne sighed happily. She always enjoyed being here with Jimmy. He was one of the most popular boys in their high school and captain of the basketball team as well. But he knew how to relax and enjoy the quiet of a spring evening. After a few minutes, Jimmy broke the silence to ask Suzanne about their plans for the prom next month. As she turned to answer him, Suzanne suddenly felt a strange and overpowering uneasiness. "Jimmy, something's wrong," she said slowly. "Wrong?" he asked, and looked surprised. "Is something wrong about the prom? After we've been looking forward to it for so long?" "No, not the prom. Something else. Right now. Something doesn't feel right in this place." Jimmy looked around and shrugged. "I don't see anything different. You're imagining things." Suzanne peered out of the car into the darkness. The strange feeling wouldn't go away. "Listen, do you hear anything?" Jimmy gave her a funny look. "What's the matter with you? Just listen, would you?" Suzanne turned off the radio, and they both sat silently, scarcely breathing. After a few moments, Jimmy turned the radio back on and said, "I don't hear a thing. I think your imagination is working overtime." Suzanne quickly turned off the radio again. "Jimmy Morrow, that's my point. It's too quiet. I don't hear the ducks or birds or crickets or anything. This place is giving me the creeps." She immediately felt chilled and rubbed her arms, looking away from him. Jimmy grinned patiently and touched her arm. "Hey, it's okay. Are you cold? Roll up your window and put on my jacket." They rolled up the car windows and settled back in their seats. "You're probably right," Suzanne said, "but I felt so weird and I don't know why." A few minutes passed without a word. Then suddenly, Suzanne stiffened and sat bolt upright again. "Jimmy!" Her voice held a note of near panic. "Please, let's get out of here. I'm absolutely sure there's—" But Jimmy was holding up his hand for silence. The radio station had interrupted the music for a special bulletin. "Escaped from the Millerton Asylum for the criminally insane early this evening. Convicted 5 years ago of committing a series of murders, he is considered emotionally unstable and extremely dangerous. Johnson uses a hook on his right arm as a replacement for the hand he lost in a train accident several years ago." Susan glanced nervously at Jimmy, who shrugged as if the report wasn't as important as he had expected. He started to turn the radio dial, but Suzanne shoved his hand away. "The state police have set up roadblocks in the surrounding areas," the announcer continued, "and a massive manhunt is underway. Anyone in possession of information concerning the whereabouts of Johnson should get in touch immediately with the county sheriff's office. And now, back to our regular programming. Jimmy, we've got to get out of here, Suzanne pleaded. That prison is only a few miles away from here. Gee, Susie, relax. That guy wouldn't come this way. An escapee would head north toward the interstate highway. But Suzanne was getting angry. Jimmy, I want to go home. Susie, don't make me mad. I'm telling you, there's nothing to worry about. Jimmy, take me home now. Okay, Jimmy sputtered. If that's the way you want it. Angrily, he turned the key in the ignition and shoved the gas pedal to the floor. The car fishtailed in the loose gravel, sending pebbles high in the air behind it. Suzanne huddled in misery against the car door. Jimmy stared ahead at the road in stony silence. In 15 minutes, they were home. Still angry, Jimmy screeched the car to a halt in Suzanne's drive and jumped out. He headed for Suzanne's side of the car, but she clambered out by herself and slammed the door behind her. In that moment, both teenagers froze. Staring at the car door, Suzanne slowly started to shriek in horror, and Jimmy felt every muscle go tight. Hanging on the handle of the car door was a razor-sharp, bloody hook. Never walk there at night. It was getting late. The slumber party at Annie's house was growing quiet. As midnight approached, one of the girls began to tell a ghost story. Someone else turned the lights down low, and all sorts of scary stories were exchanged. You know, our house is only a block away from the cemetery, said Annie. You wouldn't believe some of the things I've seen while looking out my window. A few of the girls giggled, but Annie looked serious as she continued. My grandmother told me never to walk in the cemetery at night. She said if you step on a grave, the person underneath will grab you and try to pull you under, and then you'll be dead too. Oh, that's just an old wives' tale, scoffed Diane. The cemetery doesn't scare me. If you're so brave, why don't you go over there right now? Joanne dared her. What for? It wouldn't prove anything, said Diane. It would just prove that you aren't the scaredy cat we all know you are, replied Annie. Scaredy cat, Diana's a scaredy cat, sang all the girls. Diane tried to hush them, but they kept on taunting her. As the girls' teasing grew more insistent, Diane finally blurted out, Okay, I'll do it. The other girls clapped their hands in excitement. Annie went over to the window of their second-story room and looked outside. Darn, the leaves on the trees hide the view of the cemetery, she said. You'll have to leave a sign to show that you were really there, so we'll know you didn't cheat. Annie glanced about her room. She went over to her desk and grabbed an old letter opener from the pencil cup. Here, Diane, take this letter opener. When you get inside of the cemetery, go stand on a grave and stick it in the ground. Then we'll all go get it in the morning. If it's there, we'll know you really aren't a scaredy cat. Diane took the letter opener, and the girls escorted her to the front door. See you soon, Diane, said Annie as she closed the door. Unless the boogeyman gets you. The night was warm but very windy. Diane wished she had put on a coat or a bathrobe over her long nightgown. But she knew the cemetery was only a block away. She could whisk over there and back in no time. As she came up to the cemetery gates, Diane walked more slowly. I've got nothing to worry about, she said to herself. There are no such thing as ghosts. Inside the iron gates, Diane looked around. The only noise she heard was the rustle of leaves in the trees. Clouds passed in the sky, causing moon shadows to dance on the tombstones. Filled with an eerie feeling, she pressed on into the old graveyard. Holding her breath and trying to calm her pounding heart, Diane picked out an old grave and stood on it. Then she bent over, grasped the letter opener, and plunged it deep in the ground. The job was done. But as she straightened up to leave, Diane felt something tugging at her nightgown. She pulled, but she couldn't free herself. She was trapped. As she struggled against the firm hold on her nightgown, she gave in to all the terror that had been building up inside her. Her horrible scream might have been heard at the house a block away, but the wind carried it off into the night. Annie looked out of her window towards the cemetery. She strained to see, but the trees blocked her view. One of the girls mentioned that Diane had been gone almost an hour. "We'd better go see what's happening to her," said Annie, beginning to worry about her friend. The girls all put their bathrobes and shoes on and walked as a group to the cemetery. There, they found Diane sprawled before a crumbling tombstone. Having accidentally stuck the letter opener through the hem of her own nightgown, she had pinned herself to the grave. So terrified was she by the thought of death's grasp, she had simply died of fright. A deadly night at the Dewdrop Inn. The wipers on the car couldn't go fast enough to clear away the torrent of water on the windshield. Sam hunched over the steering wheel, straining to see the road, but his headlights only reflected the rain pouring down in front of them. What a horrible night to be out, he thought. At least there's nobody else crazy enough to be driving on this mountain road. But as Sam rounded a curve, terror shot through him as he realized he was wrong. Just ahead were two sets of headlights side by side, advancing fast. A car passing a truck on a curve in this weather? Sam braked wildly and tried to avoid the oncoming vehicles, but there was nowhere to turn. At the last moment, he ducked down, covering his head with his arms. The crash was like an explosion. Glass flew everywhere, and steel bent with a sickening sound. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. Sam slowly opened his eyes and looked around. Rain was beating on his face through the broken windshield. The car was totally demolished, but Sam realized with amazement that he was all right. The steering wheel was pushed against his chest, but he managed to wriggle free. Twisting around carefully, Sam climbed out of the car through the windshield. The hood of the car was crumpled up like an accordion. It was smashed against a huge boulder to the side of the road. The car and the truck that had caused the accident were nowhere in sight. Sam slid off the car into the mud, rain continuing to pour down on him. He looked up and down the road. Could have happened to them, he wondered. Seems like at least one of them would have stopped to see if I was okay. Across the highway shone the lights from a small building, a roadside tavern. Through the rain, Sam could dimly make out a sign. The place was called the Dewdrop Inn. He started immediately towards the inn. Luckily for me, Sam thought, at least I'll be able to dry off and call for help. I could have been stuck here for hours. When he reached the door of the inn, he could hear the strains of a popular country song playing on the jukebox. Ducking inside, Sam shook the rain off his jacket. The place was full of people seated at tables, dancing and milling around. Loud conversation and laughter added to the noise of the music. That's strange, thought Sam as he viewed the scene. There weren't any cars out front. They all must be parked out back. He spied the bartender, who greeted Sam with a toothy smile as he wound his way through the tables to the bar. "Howdy, friend. What can I get you?" "Do you have a phone I can use?" "I've got a phone," said the bartender, "but you can't use it." Sam looked bewildered. The bartender smiled again. "The lines are down. Didn't you notice the storm?" "Sure did," said Sam, not very amused. "Listen, I just had a wreck and totaled my car. Some people are expecting me in the city." The bartender continued to smile as if he hadn't heard Sam's bad news. "Gee, fella, I'm sorry about that. But you're not going anywhere in this storm. Sit down and make yourself comfortable. The folks in here are real friendly." An attractive young woman suddenly peered at Sam's shoulder. "Sit down at the table over here," she said. "You look tired." He nodded in agreement. He was tired, and he felt very shaken by the accident. Besides, he thought, the bartender was probably right. There was nothing he could do at the moment. As he took off his jacket, he noticed it was already dry, as were his pants and shoes. "How in the world did that happen?" he muttered to himself. "I was soaked when I walked in here." The young woman brought him a sandwich and a cup of coffee. She sat down with him and asked him why he was traveling on such a stormy night. Sam answered her briefly as he looked more closely at his surroundings. The tavern seemed old, but not run down. Several couples were shuffling their feet to the music from the jukebox. Others were talking in groups of 3s and 4s. At least 2 card games were in progress. As he stared, a man looked up from one of the card games and mentioned to Sam, "Do you want to play cards?" he called. "We've been saving a place just for you. In fact, we've already dealt you in." Sam looked at the vacant chair the man was waving toward him. "Sure, why not?" he thought. "I've got nothing better to do." He moved to the crowded table and swept up the pile of cards at his place. "What are we playing?" Sam's eyes flooded open. He groggily thought back to the night before he tried to remember where he was. Slowly it all came back. The accident, the tavern, the card game. He lifted his head from the table where he was slumped and he looked around. "Wait a minute," he thought in confusion. "What's happened to this place?" Cobwebs were everywhere, and a thick coat of dust covered the room. It looked as if no one had set foot inside the inn for years. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Voices could be heard outside. Stretching his stiff joints, Sam made his way to the window when he saw chilled him to the bone. Beside the wreckage of his car was an ambulance and 2 police cruisers. The ambulance attendants were placing a body on a stretcher. Then they covered it with a blanket, pulling it up over the head. As they slid the stretcher into the ambulance, a patrolman uncovered the face for just a moment. Sam recognized himself. Letting out a shriek of terror, Sam pounded on the glass, but his fist made no sound as it made contact, and the window pane didn't even rattle. "That poor guy didn't have a chance," one of the patrolmen said. His chest was crushed by the steering wheel. A medic came over to the policeman. "I don't know why we don't just wait here on those stormy nights," he said. "There must have been at least 40 people killed smashing into that boulder over the last 20 years. Sam felt the horrible truth start to wash over him. Could it be that he was dead? The men outside looked towards the tavern. "Ever since the dewdrop closed, there's been one accident after another," said the other patrolman. "Come on, let's get out of here." Panic-stricken, Sam ran to open the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. He pounded on the door, but again there was no sound. A familiar voice came from the back of the tavern. "Settle down, neighbor. Like I told you last night, you're not going anywhere." Sam turned around and recognized the bartender's toothy grin. The figure standing behind the bar, cleaning glass, was a smiling skeleton. The Night of the Sasquatch. In the mountain wilderness of Idaho, a group of Boy Scouts was on its annual winter campout. The trip was to last 5 days. They would hike for 2 days into a snowy wilderness, stay a 3rd day at a remote cabin, and then start the journey back. Only the best scouts could be allowed to make the trip. Each fall, the boys who wanted to go on the campout had to pass a rigorous wilderness survival test. Leading the group was an Indian named Katuni of the Nez Perce tribe. An expert on the wilderness, Katuni was the descendant of people who had lived here long before the white man had come. He knew all the stories and legends about the mountains. Many scouts had made the long trip just to listen to Katuni tell his tales. After 2 full days of hiking and an all-night stay in pup tents, the scouts reached the remote cabin. To the weary boys, it looked like a castle. Inside were a number of bunk beds, on which they rolled out their sleeping bags. Soon a huge fire was roaring in the stone fireplace. The scouts were able to thaw out in front of the fire and cook a hot meal. The cabin seemed a safe and cozy haven. Later that night, the boys gathered around Katuni beside the fire. In a low voice, he started relating some bit of ancient Indian lore. The room smelled like smoke. The golden glow of fire made shadows dance on Katuni's lined face. The Indian spoke about his tribe and the battles they had fought to keep their lands. As the boys hung on every word, he told them about his people's beliefs that spirits lived in rocks and trees and animals. Then he told them about Sasquatch. The Sasquatch never show themselves to men, said Katuni. They live high in the mountains, away from civilization, but they have fewer places to go now. There are too many people. What did the Sasquatch look like? Asked one of the scouts. They are tall, bigger than most men. Hair covers their bodies, and they have a strange smell. They fear nothing. They just want to be left alone. But if you threaten them, they will attack you without mercy. Another boy spoke up. Have you ever seen one? Katuni looked into the fire. I have seen their tracks a few times, he said. The track is like a man's foot, only much bigger with claws. I have seen the Sasquatch itself just once. Many years ago, not far from this place. The boys sat quietly, a few shuddering at the thought of meeting a Sasquatch. Suddenly, a mournful wail from deep in the forest pierced the silence. Katuni sat upright, cocking his head, his hand held to his ear. The scouts started to murmur. Quiet, commanded the Indian. The unearthly cry echoed through the night. A wolf, said the Indian. Enough stories, time to sleep. The scouts crawled into their sleeping bags, but it was a long while before anyone could fall asleep. The next day, the boys had forgotten all about the wolf. They romped in the snow, cut firewood, and cleaned out the cabin. They were so busy they didn't notice that Katuni had slipped away alone. By the time of the evening meal, groups of 2 and 3 boys were going off in different directions, calling for Katuni. They returned at dark. Their leader was nowhere to be found. The boys ate their supper in silence. Some of the younger scouts were frightened. The older boys tried to quiet their fears. Katuni knows how to take care of himself, said one. He'll be back soon. Yeah, but why did he leave us alone? Asked another. No one had an answer. During the evening, the scouts took turns looking out the window, shining a flashlight into the wilderness. As the sun had set, it had begun to snow, lightly at first, but now more heavily. The flashlight's beam reflected only the large, fluffy flakes. In a corner of the room, 3 of the Eagle Scouts tried to figure out what to do next. The troop had planned to stay in the cabin 2 nights and 1 day. They were due to leave tomorrow. Instead, they would have to stay and send out search parties to look for Katuni. But on the following day, they would have to start their hike back. They did not have enough food to stay any longer. As the boys made their plans, the forest suddenly echoed with the same wail everyone had heard the night before. That doesn't sound like a wolf to me, one Eagle Scout told the other. It doesn't even sound like a coyote, replied the other. It almost sounds human. The scouts broke into search parties the next day. They wandered about the forest all day, calling Katuni's name, but the hunt was fruitless. The snow continued to fall, and by evening nearly a foot had been added to what was already on the ground. The younger boys were clearly worried about Katuni, although they had confidence the Eagle Scouts would get them back home safely. It was dark when the scouts were finishing their supper. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear. A full moon cast a bluish light on the new fallen snow. The boys froze when they heard the wail. This time, they were sure it was much closer. Too close. With no warning whatsoever, the door of the cabin burst open. Standing in the doorway was Katooni. His heavy coat was shredded and stained with blood. His face had been mauled. He stumbled weakly and grabbed the door for support. "Sasquatch!" he groaned. In another moment, he slid to the floor. Behind him stood the creature itself, tall, covered with hair, and giving off a choking stench. 3 days later, a couple of rangers made it to the cabin on snowmobiles. Alarmed when the boys had not returned, the scouts' parents had alerted authorities. Calling to the boys, the rangers approached the cabin. They pushed open the door and looked around in surprise. The boys' sleeping bags were still spread out in the bunks. Remnants of food lay half-eaten in mess kits. Coats and boots were scattered about, but there was no sign of life. Only a small blood stain on the floor by the door pointed to foul play. The scouts had simply vanished. The rangers circled the area on their snowmobiles, but were no leads to follow. The snowstorm had obliterated any tracks that might have been there. Using their mobile radio, they called back their unfortunate news, then prepared to stay the night. The rangers had just finished eating supper when they heard it. The terrifying tale of Talipo. Years ago, an old man lived deep in the dark woods of Tennessee. Because he never came out of the forest and was never heard to speak a civil word to any human being, the folks around there called him simply the hermit. No one could remember the time when the hermit had not lived there. People believed, and they were probably right, that they had better keep their distance from the crusty old man, and no one really cared to visit him in his forest cabin up in the hills. There were legends about that part of the forest, tales of hikers, bird watchers, and loggers who had headed that way and had never been heard from again. But the hermit wasn't frightened. He had 2 big dogs, Shep and Curry, to protect him. He loved those dogs more than a mother loves her children. At mealtimes, the hermit fed his dogs first with the food from his table. Shep and Curry shared the hermit's one-room log cabin, and the old man always let them take the warmest spots by the fire on cold winter evenings. Never had there been more loyal dogs. Shep and Curry were totally devoted to the hermit, and they never left his side. One day, the hermit and his dogs were fishing at a stream about half a mile away. They were gone for most of the day, and when they returned, the cabin door was open. Inside, everything was a complete mess. Cans of food lay scattered on the floor. Furniture was turned over. Curtains were torn, and the hermit's homemade banjo was crushed and broken. The only clue to be found was a single footprint. A bag of flour had been spilled on the floor. The white stuff gave a ghostly coating to 1/4 of the room. In the midst of the flour was a single white print, large and beastly. It was unlike anything the hermit had ever seen. But the hermit wasn't frightened. Instead, he was angry. He was sure that children from the village a few miles away had broken into his cabin, trying to scare him. They could have drawn the strange animal track on the flour. The hermit set about that very afternoon, putting a new and bigger lock on his door. Several days later, the old man was cooking a stew in the big kettle, hanging in his fireplace. It was late afternoon, just starting to get dark. Shep and Curry had gone outside the cabin to play. The hermit hadn't noticed that he could no longer hear their barking. As he was stirring the stew, the old man heard a scratching on the door. Thinking it was his dogs, he went to let them in. He flung open the door and jumped back in horror. Before him was a creature about 7 feet tall. It stood on 2 legs and had a face like a man, but it was covered with matted hair, and it had a long pointed tail. Breathing with a heavy, rasping noise, The beast started into the cabin. The hermit let out a yell and grabbed his axe, which was just inside the door. As the hermit swung the axe wildly, the creature backed off just enough to miss the swoosh of the passing blade. The hermit swung again. This time he caught the creature's tail against the wall. The sharp blade did its work, and the tail, cleanly severed, fell to the floor. The creature gave a horrible scream and ran towards the woods. The dogs, returning to the cabin, gave chase and followed the creature into the thicket, howling and snarling viciously. After a while they returned, much to their master's relief. The hermit was badly shaken. He would have to keep his beloved dogs nearby from now on. Of course, the creature probably wouldn't return. The old man felt sure his loyal dogs had killed it. As he started to calm down, the hermit looked at the tail on the floor. Not one to waste anything, he prepared the meaty morsel and threw it into the kettle. That night he and the dogs had a fine supper of creature tail stew. Deep in the night, all was quiet in the cabin. As the moon crossed the sky and its light broke in through the window, the hermit woke to the sound of scratching at the cabin door. The dogs lifted their heads and growled. It has to be the creature, thought the hermit. The scratching noise moved to the side of the cabin. Slowly lifting the bar, the hermit inched open the door, the dogs at his heels. Shep, Curry, get him, he cried as the dogs bounded outside and around the corner of the cabin. A terrible howling followed. In the moonlight, the hermit could dimly see the dogs hounding the huge beast back into the woods. As the creature disappeared into the night, the old man heard the howling turn to an eerie cry. Talipo, talipo, all I want's my talipo. The next night, the hermit was awakened once again by the sound of scratching at the door. Like the previous night, he sicked his dogs on the hairy intruder, and the tailless creature fled. And again, in the night, he heard the same voice wailing, Talipo, talipo, all I want's my talipo. With a feeling of dread, the hermit lay awake on the third night, knowing the scene would be repeated. Once again, the scratching. Again, the dogs were loosed on the beast. But this time, Shep and Curry did not return. In the morning, the old man found his pets dead by the stream. He looked at their bodies in horror. Their tails were gone. Heartbroken, the hermit stayed in his cabin day and night, his shotgun by his side. The creature didn't return, but every night he thought he could still hear it calling, Talipo, talipo. Finally, one night in the early hours just before dawn, the hermit heard the same familiar scratching, but this time the noise was coming from the foot of his bed. Shaking the sleep from his eyes, the hermit sat bolt upright and found himself staring into the contorted face of the creature. Talipo, talipo, all I want's my talipo, moaned the beast, which looked more human than before. I don't have it, cried the hermit, his eyes fixed on the creature, while his hand frantically searched for his gun. Oh, yes, you do, came the last low growl of the beast. Claws extended, sprang at the hermit's throat. All that's left of the hermit's old cabin these days is the fine stone chimney standing alone in the woods. But people say if you're up at the old place on moonlit night when the wind blows from the north, you can still hear the same unearthly moan echoing through the forest. Talipo, talipo, all I want's my talipo. Well, everyone, I hope you have enjoyed those stories of legends in and around the South and other areas of the United States. I hope you all enjoy your Halloween. Stay safe and stay spooky. Love you, Jessie Fam.